Cops target black woman. Unaware she's a Pentagon official. Court stunned by the truth. Althea Patrice Johnson had always viewed Washington, D.C. as a city of contradictions, a place built on ideals of freedom and democracy, yet filled with political maneuvering and the quiet hum of power. As a senior policy advisor at the Pentagon, Althea walked a fine line. On one side was her desire to serve her country, but on the other, the knowledge that her every move might be under greater scrutiny than most, simply because of the color of her skin. Still, she persevered. Over the years, she had built a reputation as a diligent, forward-thinking strategist, earning the trust of some of the nation's most prominent defense officials. At 36, with a quiet confidence that belied the weight of her position, Althea would often leave her Pentagon office long after the halls had emptied. One such evening in early autumn, she found herself driving to meet a longtime friend, an Army colonel she'd known since their days at Howard University. The plan was to meet at a small bistro in Arlington. The night was crisp, the moon bright, and traffic light. Althea drove a modest sedan, an unassuming Ford Fusion hybrid. Despite her rank and substantial salary, she preferred a low-profile, no flashy sports car, no tinted windows to project self-importance. After all, her mother had raised her to be humble and remember her roots. Each mile she passed reminded her of her mother's proud face at her doctoral graduation, when her mom had told her that Althea would make a difference, not just in the armed services, but in the entire nation. That evening, she replayed a crucial meeting in her head, where she had presented a strategic plan for improving cybersecurity measures across several military branches. The top brass had seemed impressed, especially since her proposals could potentially save millions in defense spending. She was excited to refine the plan before her next meeting with Secretary Lloyd J. Austin III, a man she greatly admired for breaking barriers as the first Black Secretary of Defense. She took pride in their shared heritage and found inspiration in his unwavering commitment to integrity. As Althea merged onto Jefferson Davis Highway, the lights of the city formed a halo in her rearview mirror. She was about 10 minutes from the bistro when she noticed the flicker of police sirens behind her. Confused, Althea quickly checked her speedometer. She was well within the speed limit. She used her turn signal, changed lanes, and slowed down, expecting the cruiser to rush past on its way to some emergency. But it didn't. Instead, the patrol car matched her speed, and she realized she was the target. Althea's heart raced, and anxiety began to gnaw at her. She had no reason to fear law enforcement, but past experiences reminded her of how easily misunderstandings could escalate. She signaled to change lanes again and carefully pulled over to the shoulder. Watching in her side mirror as the two officers emerged from the cruiser, their silhouettes long in the headlights, Althea briefly wondered if she had forgotten to renew her tags or if a taillight was out. She couldn't recall any issues with her car, though she always kept it in pristine condition. She rolled down her window and placed both hands visibly on the steering wheel. Her professional experience and her mother's lessons had taught her to be extra cautious. The first officer reached her driver's side window. He was tall, imposing, with a badge that read Officer Denton. A second officer, a shorter man with a shaved head and scruffy beard named Officer Pratt, lingered near the trunk of the sedan, scanning the license plate. "Good evening, officer," Althea said, her voice calm and respectful. She had perfected that polite tone over the years, the one that assured people she was no threat. "License and registration," Officer Denton said, his voice cold, his gaze hidden behind dark aviator sunglasses, even at night. "Yes, sir," Althea replied, retrieving her documents from her purse and glove compartment. She handed them over smoothly, the way one might during a standard traffic stop. The officer took the documents but continued to stare at her. The silence stretched taut, like a violin string. Althea's instincts told her something was off. Normally, an officer would explain the reason for the stop or at least run the details quickly. Instead, Denton just kept looking at her, sizing her up. "Step out of the car," he finally said, his voice low. Althea's heart quickened. "Is there a problem, officer?" she asked, maintaining her composure. "We'll see," he replied, taking a half step back and resting a hand on his holster. Fear and confusion spun in Althea's mind. She thought about the next day's meeting at the Pentagon and how everything she had worked for could be overshadowed. By this point, she complied, carefully unbuckling her seatbelt and stepping out of the car. She told herself that she was not only a private citizen but also one of the highest-ranking officials with top-level security clearance in the country. She had done nothing wrong, and this would be resolved quickly. Little did she know, this routine traffic stop would trigger a catastrophic series of events that would shake the foundation of her life, lead to an explosive courtroom confrontation, and ultimately disturb the halls of power she had walked through for years. Althea stood by the roadside, the night's chill making her shiver, more from adrenaline than cold. The steady whoosh of passing vehicles on the highway highlighted her sense of vulnerability. Officer Denton handed her license to Officer Pratt, who retreated to the patrol car to run her information. Hands placed on the hood, Denton instructed, nodding toward Althea's car. She froze, swallowing her disbelief. She was a law-abiding citizen, not a fugitive. There was no reasonable suspicion for this level of aggression. Still, she thought that even if it came to spending one night in custody, it would be far better than resisting and risking her safety. She carefully placed her palms on the hood. Denton began a perfunctory pat-down, his manner more forceful than necessary at times. His touch brushed too close to discomfort, but Althea gritted her teeth. She had to keep her composure, just like when presenting complicated defense strategies to impatient generals. Showing fear or anger could escalate the situation. Meanwhile, Officer Pratt, standing behind them, had his radio crackling with static. Althea heard fragments, no prior record, valid license, and no outstanding. As her mind spun, there was nothing to find. They would let her go, right? Once Denton finished his search, he allowed Althea to stand up. He exchanged a look with Pratt, who handed her back the license. But his expression remained guarded. "Everything checks out," he muttered, almost as though displeased by this fact. "We still need to verify something else." "What exactly do you need to verify?" Althea asked carefully, trying to keep her tone steady despite her simmering frustration. They had no probable cause to keep detaining her. Was this a random drug search or racial profiling? She didn't want to jump to conclusions, but the tension in the air was thick with suspicion. Denton ignored her question. Instead, he walked to the passenger side of Althea's car and shined his flashlight inside. "You traveling alone?" he asked. "Yes, officer. I'm heading to meet a colleague for dinner," Althea replied, still standing by the hood. "Would you like his number? He can confirm I'm meeting him." But Denton didn't respond. He yanked open the passenger door, which was already ajar from when Althea retrieved her registration. He rifled through the contents. Althea's mind raced. She had no weapons, no drugs, nothing incriminating. But the intrusion still felt violating. Out of the corner of her eye, she saw Officer Pratt walking toward the trunk. "Pop it," he ordered, tapping on the trunk with his flashlight. Althea's throat tightened. This was going too far. "I can open it for you, but I'd like to know why," Althea said firmly. "I'm not consenting to a search, but I'm not resisting your request either." She recalled the protocols from self-defense workshops and legal seminars. You can verbally refuse consent, but physically resisting is dangerous. The trunk clicked open. Pratt flipped it up, shining his flashlight over a neatly packed duffel bag, a small toolkit, and a spare tire. He rummaged through the bag, revealing a pair of gym shoes, sweatpants, a water bottle, and a worn copy of Duty, Memoirs of a Secretary at War by Robert M. Gates, ironically, a book about a former Secretary of Defense. Denton moved back to stand near Althea. Her mind spun. This felt all too familiar, like the stories she'd heard from friends about racial profiling and humiliating, unnecessary car searches, especially at night. She was usually cautious about driving late alone, but tonight had felt safe, so close to Arlington and the Pentagon. And yet, here she was. After a few minutes of rummaging, Pratt slammed the trunk shut. "It's clean," he said, almost begrudgingly. Denton's expression hardened, as though Althea's innocence had offended him. "Ma'am, do you know why we stopped you?" he finally asked, offering some semblance of an explanation. Althea inhaled. "No, officer. I wasn't speeding, and my tags are up to date. Is there a malfunction with my taillight?" Denton hesitated. "We received a call about a suspicious vehicle in this area. Your car matched the description." Althea almost laughed at the absurdity of it. A suspicious vehicle, a silver Ford Fusion. That could describe half the midsize sedans on the road. She decided not to argue. "Well, you've confirmed my details. May I retrieve my belongings from the car?" she asked, nodding toward her purse still resting on the driver's seat. Denton seemed annoyed but grunted in assent. Althea walked around, grabbed her purse, and quietly slipped her driver's license back into her wallet. As she turned, Officer Pratt's radio crackled again. A new voice came through, urgent but unintelligible at first. He stepped away to respond. Something in his stance shifted as he pivoted sharply, eyes narrowing at Althea. "Dispatch wants us to bring you in," he said flatly. "Bring me in," Althea echoed, stunned. "On what grounds?" Her throat tightened, and before she could process what was happening, Officer Denton moved with sudden decisiveness. He seized her arm, twisted it behind her back, and snapped a pair of handcuffs around her wrists. Pain shot up her shoulder, and she gasped, her eyes filling with tears from the shock, but she fought to hold them back. This was unreal. "You're under arrest," Pratt intoned, disregarding her questions. The details they had given were vague at best. Something about being linked to an incident reported earlier that night in the same area. Althea wanted to protest, to invoke her rights, to shout that she was a Pentagon official, but she held back. Experience had taught her that declarations of importance rarely helped, especially in the heat of a tense situation. Her dignity demanded she remain calm. There would be a time and place to reveal her position and have the whole farce dismantled. For now, she just needed to ensure her physical safety. As the officers guided her into the back of the squad car, Althea felt her world tilt. She thought about her mother again, who had always warned her about encounters with law enforcement. She thought of her father, a veteran who had instilled in her a love for the military. She thought about all the countless hours she had invested in her career, building trust in a defense community that wasn't always inclusive. And now she was the one in handcuffs. The hush of the road behind her gave way to the hum of the cruiser's engine. Red and blue lights flared, dancing across her reflection in the window. She swallowed hard, a sense of foreboding creeping in. The night had taken a turn she never saw coming. The interior of the police station was a sterile labyrinth of fluorescent lights and echoing footsteps. Althea's heart pounded as the metal cuffs bit into her wrists, a constant reminder of her predicament. She had spoken up as politely as she could during the ride, asking why she was being taken in, but the officers only mumbled about protocol, deferring her questions with cold silence. Upon arrival, she was led through booking. A camera flashed for her mugshot, a humiliating moment that seemed to stretch on forever. Althea kept her chin up, trying to maintain her dignity. They took her fingerprints next. She complied, the black ink smudging her fingertips. She caught the curious stares of a few station staff, who seemed puzzled by her expensive suit jacket and measured demeanor. She didn't look like a typical arrestee, but no one stepped in. Protocol marched forward like an indifferent machine. After being searched once again, this time by a female officer who treated her with the same suspicion, Althea was escorted down a narrow corridor. The gray cinder block walls pressed in, intensifying her claustrophobia. She was placed in a small holding cell, its metal benches bolted to the floor. The only window was a reinforced glass slit in the door. She tried to collect her thoughts. Her phone had been confiscated. She needed to make a call, but the officers had told her to wait. Althea's frustration grew. Every minute spent here jeopardized her reputation and complicated her responsibilities at the Pentagon. Tomorrow morning, she was scheduled to finalize the cybersecurity proposal with senior staff. Her presence was critical, and if word of her arrest spread, the ramifications could be disastrous for both her career and her personal life. A distant clang signaled someone approaching. A short, balding officer opened the cell door. "Time for your statement," he said curtly, stepping aside. Althea followed him into a cramped interrogation room with one flickering overhead light. Officer Denton was seated at a table, leaning back in his chair as though he owned the place. Officer Pratt hovered near the door. Another man, in a wrinkled suit, sat across from Denton. He looked disheveled, as though woken from his bed. Althea guessed he was a detective on the midnight shift. The detective motioned for Althea to sit opposite him. "Detective Rowland," he said, flipping open a notepad. "You're Miss Johnson, correct?" "Althea Patrice Johnson," she replied. He glanced up, eyes narrowing. "Says here you live in D.C. and hold a position in government service. Care to elaborate?" Althea considered her words. Revealing too much might complicate matters, but withholding information could prolong her detention. "I'm a senior policy advisor at the Pentagon," she said calmly. "I have top-level security clearance. That's all I can share without proper protocol." Detective Rowland snorted softly, skepticism etched on his face. "Right, top-level security clearance," he echoed. "I assume you have a supervisor we can contact to verify?" Althea's tension eased slightly. Verification was the key to her release. "Yes," she replied, her voice steady. "I'd like my phone call now. I can provide you with the direct line to my immediate superior, Colonel Stephen McKnight. If that's not sufficient, you can also contact the Pentagon Security Office. They'll confirm everything."
Détective Roland scribbled a note.
"We'll see about that. First, Miss Johnson, we have a reported incident in the area where you were stopped. An armed robbery at a convenience store. The suspect was described as a black female in a silver sedan. We're looking into it. Care to offer an alibi for your whereabouts earlier tonight?" Althea exhaled, her frustration rising. "I left the Pentagon around 8. I drove straight to Arlington. I can't prove it without my phone, but my GPS logs would confirm my route." Detective Rowland nodded, scribbling more notes. "Officers Denton and Pratt say you were acting suspiciously during the stop, refusing to exit the vehicle." "That's not accurate," Althea countered. "I complied immediately. They searched my car without my consent, but I didn't resist. You'll see that in any dashcam footage." Denton scoffed from across the table, arms folded. "We had probable cause. You matched the description of the suspect." Althea swallowed her anger. "Let me be clear. I had nothing to do with any robbery. I'm happy to provide any evidence to clear this up quickly." Detective Rowland watched her intently. "We'll run the dash cam footage and also see what the store's surveillance tapes show. If you're clean, we'll figure out next steps." Althea folded her hands in her lap, forcing composure. She needed that phone call. She needed to contact Colonel McKnight, someone who would understand the gravity of her arrest. A Pentagon official with an impeccable record. Finally, the detective glanced at Pratt. "Take Miss Johnson for her call?" he said, sounding half bored, half intrigued. "Then return her to the holding cell." Officer Pratt led Althea down another hallway. She was handed an old rotary phone placed on a small metal shelf. Pratt hovered nearby, not bothering to give her any privacy. Althea dialed the direct line to Colonel McKnight, praying he would answer. On the third ring, a groggy voice responded. He had likely just settled in for the evening. "Colonel McKnight speaking," he said, clearly puzzled by the late-night call. "Colonel?" Althea said softly, desperation creeping into her voice. "It's Althea Johnson. I'm at the Arlington Police Department. I've been arrested on suspicion of an armed robbery. I had nothing to do with—" "What?" he exclaimed, his voice instantly alert. "That's Althea? What in the world is going on?" She quickly explained the situation in brief sentences, aware that Officer Pratt was eavesdropping. "They won't believe who I am. They won't confirm it. I need help, Colonel." "All right, calm down," McKnight said, regaining his military edge. "I'll make some calls right now, see what's going on. Stay put, follow protocol, and don't worry. I'll get you out." Althea hung up, relief and anxiety swirling within her. She knew Colonel McKnight had influence, but would the local police care? She'd have to wait, and waiting was the hardest part. Officer Pratt escorted her back to the holding cell. Inside, Althea leaned against the wall, the cold of the cinder block pressing through her suit jacket. She tried to focus on tomorrow, on the plan to finalize the cybersecurity proposal. The best minds in the Pentagon had trusted her with this project. Yet here she was, handcuffed and humiliated. She pressed her eyes shut, willing herself not to cry. Minutes stretched into hours. She heard distant chatter, the buzz of a phone ringing intermittently. Each time, she hoped it was Colonel McKnight calling the station. But no one came to release her or offer further updates. The weight of injustice bore down on her. Despite her top-tier position, it felt like she was trapped in a Kafkaesque nightmare with no way out. In that silent cell, Althea realized this was more than a misunderstanding. It was a collision of prejudice, bureaucracy, and just plain bad timing. But she vowed this ordeal wouldn't break her. Tomorrow, if everything went well, she'd walk out with her head held high. And perhaps the officers who had so casually dismissed her would face a reckoning they would never forget. By the time dawn broke, Althea had barely slept on the cold metal bench in her cell. Memories of the fluorescent lights, the metallic echo of heavy doors, and the stale smell of disinfectant weighed on her. She had lost track of how many hours had passed since she'd been booked. Occasionally, an officer would walk by, glance into the cell, and move on without a word. Finally, just past sunrise, the cell door swung open. Detective Rowland stood there, looking somewhat uneasy. "Come with me," he said in a gruff voice. Althea rose, feeling every stiff muscle protest as she stood. He led her to a different interrogation room than before. A small space with a table, 2 chairs, and no windows. There, she saw Colonel Stephen McKnight, standing in casual civilian attire but carrying himself with unmistakable military bearing. His face was set in stern lines. Detective Rowland cleared his throat. "Colonel McKnight has been verifying your credentials. We're still cross-referencing some details." McKnight's eyes flicked to Althea, scanning her for any sign of injury. "Althea, are you all right?" he asked quietly. She nodded, though she felt anything but okay. Detective Rowland began. "I've provided multiple confirmations of Miss Johnson's identity and her position at the Pentagon. Her clearance level is TS/SCI, and I've confirmed that she was at the Pentagon until about 8 p.m. last night. The logs from the main entrance and the guard stations also confirm her exit time." Rowland scratched his head. "Yes, Colonel, but we have a suspect matching her description in an armed robbery case. We can't just release her until..." "Until what?" McKnight snapped, the impatience in his voice palpable. "Until you railroad a high-ranking government official because you can't be bothered to examine the surveillance footage from the convenience store or the dash cam from the arresting officer's car?" He tossed a folder onto the table, brimming with documents. "Here's a partial record from the store's cameras. I had my own team pull it early this morning. The suspect isn't even wearing the same color outfit, let alone matching Miss Johnson's license plate. You can see it's a different make and model of car entirely." Rowland rifled through the documents, his expression shifting from defensive to uncertain. Althea watched him carefully. She could sense the tension in the room. McKnight was outraged, and rightfully so. "Colonel," Rowland said in a measured tone, "we're verifying everything, but you must understand we acted on a credible tip." McKnight cut him off. "A tip?" "More like a lazy assumption." He steadied himself before adding, "There's more going on here than meets the eye. I'm sure Miss Johnson will be fully exonerated once the evidence is properly reviewed." Althea finally spoke up, her voice surprisingly firm. "How long until I'm officially released?" Rowland gave her a tight-lipped look. "We've asked the store owner to come in for a positive ID. If that doesn't match, we'll proceed with releasing you. But we have procedures to follow." "Procedures?" McKnight echoed, bitterness creeping into his tone. "Fine. We'll wait. But mark my words, I'll be filing formal complaints against the officers who made this arrest without sufficient cause." A knock on the door interrupted them. Officer Pratt peeked in, his face unreadable. "Detective, the store owner's here."
Roland nodded.
Althea and McKnight were led to another, slightly larger room with a one-way mirror. Inside, the store owner, a gaunt man with a tired face, shifted nervously in a chair. Detective Roland motioned for Althea to step into view. The store owner eyed Althea, confusion etched on his face. That's not her," he said, glancing from Althea to Roland. "The woman who robbed my store had different hair, for one. She had braids. She was shorter, heavier. She definitely wasn't wearing a business suit." Relief flooded Althea. She felt the tension in her shoulders loosen. Roland coughed, looking visibly uncomfortable. "You're absolutely sure?" he asked, as though still hoping for a different answer. "Positive," the store owner said, leaning forward. "I don't know how she got picked up, but that's not the woman who pulled a gun on me." Silence descended over the room. Colonel McKnight exhaled sharply, relief mingling with righteous anger. Althea looked at Roland, waiting for him to say something. Anything. Finally, Roland spoke, addressing Althea. "Ma'am, it seems there's been a mistake. You'll be free to go as soon as we finish the paperwork." "A mistake," McKnight repeated, shaking his head. "An egregious error, more like." Within minutes, Althea was signing documents and retrieving her personal belongings. Her purse, phone, and keys. She noticed fresh scrapes on her phone's casing, probably from being tossed around during the search. Her business card holder was half crushed. As she slipped her phone back into her purse, she saw Denton and Pratt standing at the far end of the station lobby. Denton met her gaze for a moment, his expression stony, before looking away. Pratt pretended to be busy with a sheaf of papers. McKnight guided Althea out into the crisp morning air. The sunlight felt liberating, but her mind was already racing through the avalanche of repercussions. Missed calls, urgent emails, the stain on her reputation. She pictured tomorrow's meeting at the Pentagon, the stares of colleagues if word got out. Sure, she'd been exonerated, but rumors had a way of traveling fast, especially in government circles. As they stood on the sidewalk, McKnight turned to Althea. "I'm sorry you had to go through that," he said quietly. "I'll personally ensure those officers are held accountable. You deserve better, and our country deserves better from those sworn to protect it." Althea mustered a tired smile. "Thank you, Colonel. I appreciate everything you did this morning. I just want to forget this nightmare and get back to work." He nodded. "I'll have a car take you home. Get some rest, maybe a change of clothes. I'll need you in my office by noon to debrief. Secretary Austin's staff called me while I was on my way here. They're eager for your final recommendations on the cybersecurity initiative." Althea blinked, trying to shift from the trauma of the last 12 hours back into the world of high-stakes defense strategy. "I'll be there," she said, determination flickering in her tired eyes. They parted ways, and as Althea slid into the back seat of a government-issued sedan, a swirl of emotions churned in her chest. Relief, rage, gratitude, exhaustion. She gazed out the window at the passing city streets, wondering how long it would take for her life to return to normal, and if normal was still an option. Little did she know, her ordeal was just the first salvo in a battle that would escalate once she stepped into the courtroom. The days leading up to the pre-trial hearing spun into a blur of depositions, legal consults, and an unexpected surge of media attention. Initially, Althea had hoped the case would remain a discreet matter, something resolved in the quiet corridors of a courthouse. But an enterprising local reporter caught wind that a Pentagon official was involved in a lawsuit against 2 Arlington police officers, and the story practically wrote itself. High-powered Pentagon advisor versus local law enforcement. By the time Althea stepped onto the courthouse steps for the first preliminary hearing, a small crowd of reporters had already gathered, microphones thrust forward, cameras clicking. A well-dressed journalist from the Washington Post called out, "Miss Johnson, can you comment on the allegations of racial profiling?" Another from a local TV station added, "Is it true you're a top-level official at the Pentagon? Have you spoken with Secretary Lloyd Austin about this?" Althea shielded her face from the camera flashes, flanked by Colonel McKnight and a Pentagon-appointed attorney, a sharp-eyed litigator named Camille Webster. Webster ushered Althea past the swirling press. "No comments for now," the attorney said in a measured tone. "We'll release a statement at the appropriate time." Inside the courthouse, the air was cool and smelled of stale coffee. Althea's nerves jangled, but she drew on her military training, maintaining composure under pressure. She and Webster took their seats behind the prosecution's table. District Attorney Renee Faulkner was already there, organizing files with quick precision. A few minutes later, Officers Denton and Pratt entered through a side door. Denton's stern glare met Althea's for a fleeting second before he looked away. Pratt, on the other hand, seemed nervous, his eyes darting around the room. They took their places at the defense table, accompanied by a union lawyer who wore a pinstriped suit a size too large. Judge Pamela Winston, a middle-aged woman with a firm gaze, called the hearing to order. She read the charges aloud. Unlawful search and seizure, false arrest, violation of civil rights. The list sounded surreal to Althea as it was stated so formally. Faulkner introduced the prosecution's stance. "Your Honor, the evidence strongly suggests that Miss Johnson was stopped without reasonable cause, searched in violation of her Fourth Amendment rights, and detained under false pretenses, an incident primarily driven by racial bias. We aim to prove that these officers acted beyond the scope of their legal authority, causing undue harm to Miss Johnson's reputation and well-being." The defense attorney objected, citing that the officers had received a tip about a robbery suspect, and in the heat of the moment, they had acted with probable cause. He insisted the officers had no intention of discrimination, and any irregularities were procedural missteps, not malicious. Judge Winston listened intently, occasionally adjusting her thin reading glasses. After the opening statements, she paused, tapping a pencil on her bench. "I want the preliminary evidence submitted to my chambers by the end of the week. Miss Johnson, you'll need to give an official deposition under oath. Officers Denton and Pratt, the same applies to you. We'll reconvene once I've reviewed the evidence." The gavel came down softly, signaling the conclusion of the day's proceedings. The tension in the room lingered, a tangible presence that clung to the walls. As Althea stood to leave, Denton and Pratt brushed past her. Denton's jaw was set, his gaze locked straight ahead. Pratt looked as though he wanted to speak, but instead, he averted his eyes. Outside, the media swarm was even larger. It appeared that local news stations had gotten wind of the hearing and arrived in full force. Ada Faulkner stepped forward to field a few questions on the prosecution's behalf, giving carefully worded statements. Althea remained silent, not wanting to be misquoted. That afternoon, in the quiet sanctuary of her Pentagon office, Althea stared at the folder containing her statement. Each page recounted the humiliating details of that night: the confusion, the fear, the handcuffs biting into her wrists. She was no stranger to high-pressure situations, but those were usually strategic, like negotiating defense budgets or planning security protocols. This, however, was personal, an assault on her dignity and identity. 2 weeks later, the trial began in earnest. Each morning, Althea arrived at the courthouse wearing tailored suits that projected confidence, even as anxiety roiled beneath her calm exterior. The hallways were awash with hushed conversation, press badges, and the occasional protester or supporter, people who had latched onto her as a symbol of broader social tensions. On the first day of formal testimonies, Althea took the stand. The courtroom was packed, with a row of cameras stationed at the back, though filming was restricted to certain segments per the judge's orders. Judge Winston presided from her bench with quiet authority, reminding everyone to maintain decorum. Ada Faulkner approached the witness stand. "Miss Johnson, could you please recount in your own words what happened on the night of your arrest?" Althea inhaled deeply, her palms damp against the wooden rail. She began at the beginning. Leaving the Pentagon, spotting the police lights in her rearview mirror, being ordered out of the car, searched, and ultimately arrested. She recounted each detail: how Denton's hand had tightened on her arm, the silent intimidation from Pratt, with measured clarity. The courtroom fell silent, every ear attuned to her voice. When Faulkner asked Althea to describe her emotional state, Althea looked directly at the jury. "I was terrified," she said, her voice catching for the first time. "I knew I was innocent, But I also knew how quickly situations like these can escalate, especially when you're a black woman dealing with officers who've already made up their minds. A few jurors shifted uncomfortably, while others nodded almost imperceptibly. Then came the defense attorney's cross-examination. He was slick with a perpetual sneer. "Miss Johnson, you claim you were cooperative, but isn't it true you hesitated when the officers asked you to exit the vehicle?" Althea's chest tightened, but she kept her voice steady. "I hesitated only because I was confused. It was a surprising demand, but I complied. The dashcam footage will show that." "And yet you accuse the officers of racial profiling?" He raised an eyebrow. "Isn't it possible they were simply responding to a tip and following standard procedure?" "I don't doubt the initial stop was related to a tip," Althea replied steadily. "But the manner in which I was treated, searched without consent, arrested despite no concrete evidence, points to bias and a disregard for my rights." The attorney pressed further, asking about her job, implying that perhaps she used her Pentagon credentials to manipulate the situation. Althea rebutted firmly, clarifying that she mentioned her position only after repeated attempts to assert her innocence fell on deaf ears. Once her testimony concluded, Althea stepped down, her heart hammering. She could see the intensity on the faces of the jury and the public gallery. Her story was a potent reminder that no status or title guarantees fair treatment, a truth that resonated far beyond the walls of that courtroom. Over the next few days, more witnesses took the stand. A forensic expert testified about the dashcam footage, explaining how it showed Althea calmly exiting her vehicle, contradicting the officer's narrative that she resisted. Internal affairs investigators presented their findings on the officer's records. Denton had multiple complaints lodged against him for excessive force, though none had ever resulted in formal discipline. Pratt had fewer marks on his record, but there were still a couple of red flags. Perhaps the biggest bombshell came mid-trial when the prosecution introduced a new witness, a former partner of Denton, who had retired from the force 2 years prior. In a sworn statement, he recounted hearing Denton make derogatory remarks about black motorists, bragging about teaching them a lesson during stops. The defense counsel objected furiously, but Judge Winston allowed the testimony, citing potential relevance to Denton's pattern of behavior. The courtroom was electric with tension. Denton shifted in his seat, his face going pale, while Pratt stared at the floor. Gasps rippled through the public gallery. Althea couldn't help but feel vindicated, though a small, sad part of her recognized that such attitudes were not isolated to one man. When Denton finally took the stand in his own defense, his composure cracked under Faulkner's relentless questioning. He stumbled through explanations, contradicting himself about why he had singled out Althea's car. At one point, he claimed the suspect's license plate matched Althea's, but Faulkner quickly produced evidence showing the plates were vastly different. Each lie chipped away. At the facade he tried to maintain, Pratt's turn came next, and he fared slightly better, blaming Denton for most of the decisions that night. However, under the pressure of cross-examination, he admitted that he never personally saw Althea do anything suspicious. He was simply backing up his partner's call. But by the end of that day, the defense looked shaken. The prosecution had painted a clear picture: Althea as an innocent woman subjected to an unlawful and biased arrest, and Denton as a cop with a history of prejudicial behavior who had roped Pratt into wrongdoing. Althea walked out of the courthouse into a sea of reporters shouting questions. The glare of cameras almost blinded her, but she felt like she could finally breathe. Yet, the final arguments were still ahead. Even so, she had a growing sense that justice was within reach and that a karmic reckoning was about to unfold. One that would be more dramatic and far-reaching than anyone in that courthouse could have anticipated. As the trial neared its conclusion, the atmosphere in the courthouse became increasingly charged. Lawyers worked long hours preparing their final arguments, while journalists staked out vantage points to catch every statement. The public gallery remained crowded with spectators trading theories on how the jury would rule. Behind the scenes, however, a separate drama was unfolding. Althea's Pentagon ties had not gone unnoticed by Denton and Pratt's defense team. Rumors circulated that they were digging into Althea's background, searching for any perceived misstep they could exploit. Financial records, security clearances, even personal social media posts. One evening, as Althea left the courthouse with Camille Webster, her Pentagon-appointed attorney, a man in a cheap suit approached, thrusting a folder at them. "Miss Johnson might want to look at this," he muttered before either could refuse. He slipped away, disappearing into the crowd. Althea opened the folder in the relative quiet of her car. Inside were photocopies of internal Pentagon memos, nothing classified, but sensitive strategic notes that shouldn't be out in public. A note scrawled in the margin read, "We can make sure these end up in the news if you don't drop the case." Her stomach lurched. Someone was trying to blackmail her, threatening to leak Pentagon documents to discredit her. She showed the file to Webster, who turned pale with anger. "This is a blatant attempt at intimidation," Webster said, seething. "We should immediately inform the judge and the district attorney." But Althea hesitated, worry gnawing at her. "If we make this public, it might compromise national security. Plus, the defense might spin it as me mishandling documents. This could spiral out of control." "That's exactly why we can't let them bully us," Webster insisted. "We have to be transparent with the court. Let the judge decide how to handle it." On the second-to-last day of the trial, another shock rippled through the courtroom. Ada Faulkner introduced a newly uncovered piece of evidence, a cluster of text messages Denton had sent Pratt immediately following Althea's arrest. In them, Denton wrote disparaging remarks about arrogant suits thinking they're above the law, and implied that a night in jail would teach her some respect. The messages hit like a bombshell. Denton's attempt to claim a good-faith mistake unraveled further. Gasps echoed in the gallery, and even the defense attorney looked momentarily speechless. That evening, Denton's lawyer approached Althea outside the courtroom with a forced smile. "I'm sure you'll be hearing from us, Miss Johnson, if you'd like to discuss a settlement." Althea stared at him, a wave of indignation washing over her. "This isn't about money," she replied icily. "It's about accountability." He flinched at her tone, then hastily retreated. The stage was set for a dramatic finale. With the blackmail attempt under investigation, damning evidence piling up, and Denton's credibility in tatters, Althea felt momentum on her side. Yet, she couldn't shake the nagging sense that a final twist was lurking just around the corner, one poised to test her resolve in ways she couldn't yet fathom. The morning of closing arguments arrived, with a crisp autumn chill in the air. The courtroom was at capacity, murmurs of anticipation coursing through the rows of observers. Althea felt the weight of countless eyes on her as she took her seat, her pulse tapping a nervous rhythm in her veins. Ada Faulkner began addressing the jury in a measured, resonant voice. "This case is not just about a single traffic stop gone wrong. It's about a systemic issue, about accountability for those entrusted to uphold the law. Officer Denton and Officer Pratt acted on bias, not evidence. They humiliated a law-abiding citizen, Miss Althea Johnson, and deprived her of her fundamental rights. We ask you to stand for justice and find them responsible for this grievous misconduct." She then recapped the evidence. The dashcam footage, Denton's derogatory text messages, the pattern of complaints in his file, Pratt's own admissions. The narrative formed a clear arc of abuse of power. When the defense attorney stood, he attempted to shift the focus. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, we all make mistakes. Officer Denton and Officer Pratt were under intense pressure following a tip about an armed robber. Could their judgment have been clouded? Possibly. But were their actions intentionally racist or malicious? The defense argues no. These are honorable officers who serve the community every day." His plea fell somewhat flat, especially in light of the text messages. The lawyer's voice lacked the earlier confidence, as though he, too, sensed the tides had turned. After both sides rested, the case was in the hands of the jury. Judge Winston gave her instructions to the jury. Althea watched them file out, her heart pounding. A hush fell over the courtroom, broken only by the sound of shifting chairs and quiet murmurs. The wait for the verdict lasted several hours. Althea paced the hallway, occasionally peeking into the milling crowd. Denton and Pratt sat in a corner with their lawyer, their expressions grim. No one made eye contact, Finally, the bailiff's voice called everyone back in. The jury foreman, an older man with thoughtful eyes, stood to deliver the verdict. We, the jury, find Officer Tom Denton and Officer Mark Pratt liable for unlawful detention, violation of civil rights, and racial profiling. We recommend punitive measures in accordance with the law. A collective exhale swept the room. Althea felt tears well up, tears of relief, vindication, and a strange ache for the system that had allowed this to happen in the first place. The judge banged her gavel, calling for order. Officers Denton and Pratt, you are hereby found guilty on the charges presented. Sentencing will take place next week. Court is adjourned. As chaos erupted, media clamoring for quotes, lawyers shaking hands. Althea stood, rooted to the spot, the enormity of the moment washing over her. She turned to see Denton being taken aside by a pair of fellow officers, his face drawn and pale. Pratt looked equally shaken. His shoulders slumped as though the weight of the entire courthouse was pressing down on him. Assistant DA Faulkner approached, offering a smile. Congratulations, Miss Johnson. The jury sided with justice today. Althea nodded, a lump in her throat preventing her from speaking. Colonel McKnight joined them, clapping a hand on her shoulder. We'll be sure to let the secretary know that the truth prevailed. The press descended like a flock of seagulls, questions flying. Miss Johnson, how do you feel about the verdict? Will you press additional charges? Is there a statement from the Pentagon? Althea raised a hand, her voice steady yet resonant. I'm grateful to the jury for upholding the rule of law. This was never about vengeance. It was about justice. I hope this outcome serves as a reminder that no one is above accountability, not even those who wear a badge. Reporters continued firing questions, but Althea gently excused herself. She navigated the throng, stepping outside into a bright, windy day. The crisp air filled her lungs, bringing a renewed sense of freedom. In the days that followed, the karmic fallout was profound. Denton was dismissed from the force and faced further internal investigations regarding past complaints. Pratt, who had cooperated more, received a lighter sentence but still lost his job. The city council announced an independent review of policing practices to prevent future injustices. Public pressure grew for improved police training and better accountability measures. For Althea, life at the Pentagon resumed with a heightened sense of purpose. Secretary Austin personally commended her courage, hinting at potential advancement opportunities. She accepted the praise graciously, though in her heart, she remained humbled by the ordeal. She recognized that many people in similar situations lacked her resources and status. Still, the victory felt like a triumph for more than just her. It was a step toward dismantling a deeply ingrained culture of mistrust and prejudice. Each day, she walked into the Pentagon with her head held high, determined to excel at her duties, serve her country, and champion the cause of justice wherever she could. As for Denton and Pratt, they became cautionary tales, a reminder that the abuse of power carries steep consequences. Some whispered that Denton struggled to find work, his reputation irrevocably tarnished. Pratt relocated to another state, hoping to rebuild a semblance of his life. Neither man escaped the reach of their own actions. In every sense, the karmic pendulum had swung back with a force few had anticipated, reminding everyone that sometimes justice does prevail, and when it does, it can be breathtakingly swift. A month after the trial ended, Althea found herself back in the same Arlington courtroom, not for another hearing, but for a community forum addressing policing reforms. The city council had invited her to speak about her experiences and provide insight into how systemic changes could be enacted. She had agreed, seeing this as an opportunity to ensure her ordeal wasn't just a headline but a catalyst for meaningful change. The audience, packed into rows of wooden seats, included local politicians, activists, and everyday citizens curious about the new initiatives. Cameras rolled quietly in the back. The media frenzy had died down significantly since the trial. On stage, a panel of speakers waited their turn. When Althea took the microphone, a hush fell. She briefly recounted her arrest, not dwelling on the details but framing it as an example of what happens when biases go unchecked. Then, She pivoted, speaking about the broader issues, training programs that neglected cultural sensitivity, the reluctance to discipline officers with repeated complaints, and the lack of accountability structures. "I come from a background of public service," she said, her voice clear and unwavering. "At the Pentagon, we operate under rigorous checks and balances. Mistakes can cost lives and disrupt national security. While policing isn't the same as military defense, both fields share a fundamental requirement for integrity and accountability. We can't tolerate negligence or bias because the cost is too high. It shatters public trust and endangers the very people we aim to protect." Her words resonated, drawing applause. She concluded by urging the city council to adopt reforms that would make such incidents less likely. More transparency in complaints, ongoing anti-bias training, and partnerships with community groups. After the forum, as Althea stepped off the stage, a young black woman approached, eyes bright with admiration. "Thank you," she said softly. "Your story gave me hope that speaking up actually matters." Althea smiled, a sense of validation warming her chest. She remembered her own fear the night she was hauled into a police cruiser, the uncertainty of how it would end. Now, she had the privilege to stand before a crowd and advocate for change, an outcome that could have easily been reversed if she hadn't had support and resources. In the ensuing weeks, Althea devoted herself fully to her work, feeling more determined than ever. Althea's Pentagon responsibilities had become even more critical as the nation navigated shifting global security demands. She led task forces, strategized with top officials, and contributed to policy decisions that shaped America's defense stance. All the while, the echoes of her courtroom battle remained with her, fueling a deeper sense of determination. One day, Colonel McKnight called her into his office. As she entered, she saw Secretary Lloyd J. Austin III seated beside him, both men wearing broad smiles. Her heart skipped a beat. "Miss Johnson, you've shown exceptional commitment, not just to your role here but to the principles of justice and public service," Austin began. "We've been observing your work on the cybersecurity initiative, and we believe you're ready for a new challenge." McKnight slid a folder across the table. Inside was an offer letter for a position as Deputy Director of Strategic Operations, a key role with significant influence. Althea's hand trembled as she read it, tears threatening to fill her eyes. She glanced up. I don't know what to say. "I'm honored, sir." "You've earned it," Austin replied. "We need leaders who excel technically but also stand firm on ethical principles. Your perseverance in the face of adversity embodies the values this nation strives to uphold." Althea nodded, her voice thick with emotion. "Thank you. I accept." That evening, after sharing the news with her mother in a jubilant phone call, Althea sat alone in her living room, reflecting on the journey. The traffic stop that had once felt like a nightmare had become a crucible, forging her into a stronger version of herself, one unafraid to confront injustice, no matter the personal cost. She looked out at the Washington skyline, the silhouette of the Pentagon visible under the moonlit sky. Tomorrow promised new responsibilities and greater pressure, but she felt prepared because, through the darkest moments, she had discovered an unbreakable truth. Real power isn't about titles or uniforms. It's about the courage to do what's right, even when the system fights back. And that was the kind of power Althea Johnson would carry with her, from the halls of the Pentagon to wherever justice needed a champion. And so concludes the remarkable journey of Althea Johnson, a high-ranking Pentagon official whose integrity was tested in the most unlikely of circumstances. From a harrowing wrongful arrest to a dramatic courtroom showdown, Althea emerged not merely vindicated but emboldened to fight for the principles she holds dear. Justice prevailed. Karma struck hard, and the repercussions reached far beyond the courthouse, prompting systemic changes in local law enforcement. Althea's relentless pursuit of the truth transformed her from a victim to a victor, proving that sometimes our darkest trials become the crucible for our greatest strength. If you found inspiration in Althea's story, be sure to give this video a thumbs up, share it with friends who need a dose of courage, and subscribe to our channel for more riveting tales. Your support helps us bring powerful stories to life, stories that remind us that justice can triumph when we stand up for what's right.